Chapter 13. We are doing it for medical science. November 1900. As the days went by, Reed and his team began looking for volunteers. Candidates had to be young and healthy, because young, healthy people had the best chance of surviving yellow fever. They had to be single, so that their sickness or death would not injure an entire family. And, of course, they had to be willing to risk getting the disease. The truth, however, was that yellow fever was so common in Cuba that anyone who set foot on the island and hadn't previously had the illness was likely to come down with it anyway. And that piece of information gave the Reed team an idea. Immigrants from Spain were landing in Cuba all the time. Many were young, healthy, and single. All of them knew that they might get yellow fever in Cuba. And maybe, the team thought, since these newcomers were already running the risk of getting the disease naturally, some of them would be willing to volunteer for the experiments. With Reed's permission, Agramonte interviewed a group of recent immigrants and carefully explained the requirements and terms. Each volunteer who signed Reed's consent form and agreed to be bitten by mosquitoes would be paid $100, the equivalent of about $2,400 in today's money. In addition, those who came down with yellow fever would receive an extra $100 and the very best medical care the U.S. Army team could possibly provide. By the time Agramonte had finished, 4 Spanish men, Antonio Benigno, Nicanor Fernandez, Vicente Precedo, and Jose Martinez, had agreed to volunteer and had signed a consent form written in English and Spanish. It was a start, and Agramonte wasn't the only recruiter. One afternoon, Medical Officer Dr. Roger Ames saw a 24-year-old civilian clerk named John Moran walking across the Camp Columbia parade ground. When Moran stopped to chat, Ames told the young man that Reed was offering money to anyone who'd volunteer for the new series of experiments. Was Moran interested in signing up? Like everyone else at Camp Columbia, Moran knew that Dr. Jesse Lazier had died of yellow fever. He knew that the disease had just about killed Carol, but young John Moran badly wanted to become a doctor. He needed a lot of money to pay for medical school. When Ames spoke, Moran later wrote in his memoirs the first idea that popped into his head was, "Just think, Johnny, what that amount of money will mean to you." The offer was tempting, but Moran didn't want to make a snap decision. He told Ames to let him sleep over it. Then he went back to his quarters to discuss the proposal with his roommate, Private John Kissinger. At midnight, the men were still talking. The danger was clear. The money was attractive. But that wasn't all. As the night wore on, Moran got more and more excited about being part of the experiments. Signing up was more than just a fast way to make some cash. It was a chance to help save lives. A chance to help make medical history. In fact, getting involved in the fight to conquer yellow fever seemed so important that Moran decided to refuse the money. He was going to take part in the experiments solely for the sake of helping science. "Don't be a fool," Kissinger told him. But Moran had made up his mind. He was positive. Finally, even Kissinger was convinced. "Whatever you do, John, I am with you," Kissinger said. "We'll volunteer together." The next morning, the 2 men went to Reed's room in the officers' quarters. The door was open. "Good morning," Reed said. "What can I do for you?" For a minute, Moran struggled for words. Then the young man poured out the story. He and Kissinger were volunteering, Moran told Reed, without the bonus or money award which the Army was offering. "We are doing it," Moran said, "for medical science." Now some people say that Reed turned to the 2 volunteers and said, I take my hat off to you, gentlemen. And some people claim that Reed said simply, I salute you. But Moran wrote in his memoir that Reed just gladly accepted with a gleam in his eyes of pleasure and satisfaction. Later, however, the Major voiced his actual feelings. Those who volunteered for the experiments, Reed said, showed a type of courage that has never been surpassed in the annals of the Army of the United States. That was high praise, and soon many men deserved it. In the weeks that followed, 15 other Americans signed up for the experiments. Although many agreed to accept money for their participation, at least one other man refused the reward and agreed to take part solely for the sake of science. The volunteer problem had been solved more easily than Reed could have expected, and it was time for the real scientific work to start.